The candlelight in the east gallery of Rothmore Hall trembled against the gilded frames as Duchess Eleanor Ashworth walked its length alone, her silk skirts whispering across marble that had not been warmed by a fire in that corridor for over an hour. The ball below still roared with laughter and violins, but up here there was only the sound of her own breathing and the hush of a house that seemed, for one suspended moment, to be holding something back from her. She had come upstairs to retrieve her mother's pearl combs, nothing more, and she would remember for the rest of her life how ordinary that errand had felt in the seconds before it stopped being ordinary at all. The tall mirror at the end of the gallery, framed in tarnished silver, and older than the house itself, had always struck her as more honest than any looking-glass she had known in her father's modest home. It did not flatter. It simply showed. She approached it now, adjusting the pearls already at her throat, and saw herself first, pale, composed, dressed in ice-blue silk that had cost more than her father earned in a year, and then, behind her own reflection, framed by the open door of the small blue parlour, seldom used since her mother-in-law's death, she saw her husband. Duke Julian Ashworth stood with his back nearly to the door, his hand resting with unmistakable intimacy at the waist of a woman in wine-coloured silk. Lady Constance Whitmore tilted her chin upward toward him with the ease of someone who had done this before, many times, in rooms just like this one. Eleanor did not gasp. She stood very still, watching herself. Watch them, two reflections, occupying the same silvered surface, one aware and one utterly unaware it was being seen at all. It was Julian's voice that broke the stillness, low and warm. "She suspects nothing," he said, and Constance laughed softly. "Eleanor suspects nothing because there is nothing in her to suspect with," he added. "She was raised to be dutiful, not clever." She did not step back. Something in her chest that had been coiled tight for 3 years began, very quietly, to loosen into something colder and far more useful than heartbreak. She lowered her eyes, turned from the mirror, and walked back toward the ballroom with a composure so complete that not a single guest would have guessed her entire world had just rearranged itself, but it had. And what Julian did not yet understand was that the quiet, dutiful Duchess he believed himself safely deceiving had just begun, in the space of a single reflected glance, to become someone else entirely. To understand how Eleanor came to stand in that gallery, one had to go back 3 years to a modest stone house in Hampshire, where her father, once a respected barrister, had spent his final solvent months trying to hide from his daughters the extent of his debts. Eleanor was the eldest of 3, and it was to her the burden of rescue eventually fell. When the Duke of Rothmore's solicitor arrived one autumn afternoon with an offer of marriage, her father had wept with relief. She had not been unwilling. She had chosen this marriage, clear-eyed, to save her family from ruin, and in the early months Julian had been courteous in a manner that passed easily for tenderness. But even in that first year, there had been small things. A locked drawer in his study he never explained. Trips to London that grew longer each season. A particular stillness among the staff whenever Lady Constance Whitmore's name arose, a stillness Eleanor had mistaken for deference to an old family friend, rather than the practised silence of servants protecting a secret they had long since stopped questioning. Constance had been introduced to her within the first 6 months. Gracious and warm, complimenting her gown, and Eleanor had liked her, entirely unable to imagine that the woman offering such praise had already spent the better part of a decade as her husband's mistress. The normal rhythm of Rothmore Hall, mornings of correspondence, afternoons of charitable calls, evenings of thin, formal dinner conversation, had felt to Eleanor like the shape marriages simply took among people of their class. It was only in the quiet hours brushing out her hair before her own small mirror that she allowed herself to wonder whether dignity was truly enough to sustain a life. There had been a torn letter fragment found by accident 18 months into the marriage, never fully read, quietly returned to its place. There had been a steward, Harrow, who avoided her eyes when she asked after certain expenditures. There had been a scullery maid who let slip that Lady Constance had taken tea in a small parlour during Eleanor's absence, then flushed scarlet and changed the subject. Eleanor had noticed all of it, in fragments, and had explained each fragment away, because uncertainty, however corrosive, had felt more bearable than confirmed betrayal. The gallery mirror had not shown her something entirely new. It had simply removed the last possibility of pretending she did not already know. In the days that followed the ball, Eleanor conducted herself with a composure that astonished even her, smiling at Constance across a neighbour's tea table, watching how easily the other woman returned it, entirely unafraid, having long ago concluded that the Duchess of Rothmore was too gentle, too dutiful, ever to pose a threat. That misjudgment, Eleanor understood, was the single greatest advantage she possessed. She began her investigation during a fortnight. When Julian travelled to London on business, she now understood lightly involved rooms she had no wish to picture. She went first to Harrow, the estate steward, and asked, with a calm authority she had spent 3 years learning to project, for a complete accounting of every expenditure drawn against her own dowry trust. "I had begun to hope you would ask me such a question directly," he admitted, and provided the records within 2 days, asking only that she receive them quietly, without mentioning the matter to anyone in the house. She spent the following week studying them by candlelight, cross-referencing every sum against the household ledgers she had kept herself. The pattern, once assembled, told the story of sustained deception, reaching back almost to the first months of her marriage. Funds settled upon her specifically to protect her independence had been steadily diverted, quarter after quarter, into a townhouse lease for Lady Constance, into jewellery Eleanor had never seen, into a life she had known nothing about. It was among Harrow's later records that she found something worse than infidelity. A parcel of tenant land, protected under her marriage settlement from sale without her written consent, had been transferred 2 years earlier to cover estate debts. At the bottom of the document was a signature bearing her name, close to her own hand, but not quite right in the slant of certain letters. She had not signed it. She had never seen it before. Eleanor travelled to Bath under the pretence of visiting an ailing aunt, to the offices of Mr. Dew. Aldous Penrose, the solicitor who had drafted her original marriage settlement, and remained, she now understood, one of the few people whose loyalty belonged to her alone. She told him everything: the gallery mirror, the ledgers, the forged deed. He examined the signature through a jeweller's loupe for a long while before setting it down. "This was not made by your hand, Your Grace. I would stake my reputation on it." He looked up at her. "Do you understand what this means? If your signature was forged to give this document the appearance of legality, then whoever authorized that forgery has committed a crime, regardless of his rank." "I intend to be free of him," Eleanor told him when he asked what she meant to do with such proof. "Not in the quiet way such things are usually managed, with everyone pretending not to notice. I want the truth known so completely that no one can later say, 'I simply grew tired of my marriage.' I have spent 3 years being called dutiful by people who meant it as praise, while believing it described a woman too meek to notice her own circumstances. I would rather be called cold by people who understand I saw clearly and acted, than continue being called dutiful by people who believe I saw nothing at all." Penrose studied her for a long moment. "Then we had better proceed thoroughly." Over the following months, working through Penrose and a discreet inquiry agent named Marsh, Eleanor assembled a case that grew steadily more damning. Marsh confirmed the townhouse lease had been renewed twice, each renewal drawn from her dowry trust. He located the young clerk, Whitfield, who had personally executed the fraudulent transfer and who admitted with visible distress that he had been instructed by the Duke's own solicitor to expedite the document without requiring Eleanor's personal appearance, on the representation that a signature already obtained. There was a night when the entire campaign nearly collapsed. Julian returned from London 3 days early, arriving while Eleanor sat at her writing desk with Marsh's latest report spread before her. She had perhaps 4 seconds to sweep the papers into a drawer and turn the key before his hand was on her door. She met him with a novel open in her lap, her heart still hammering long after he retired, apparently satisfied. From that night forward she kept no evidence within Rothmore Hall at all, asking Penrose to hold everything in Bath instead. Each new document brought its own private grief, but Eleanor no longer allowed that grief to stop her. She learned to sit across from Julian at dinner and discuss the weather with perfect equanimity, while carrying, in memory now, rather than in any drawer, the means of his complete undoing. Handwriting expert Mr. Braden Fenwick, engaged by Penrose, confirmed under formal examination that the deed signature bore clear signs of deliberate imitation. Whitfield's sworn testimony placed the instruction directly with Julian, rather than with any overzealous clerk. With the ledgers, the forged deed, and the clerk's statement together, Eleanor now possessed a case Penrose assured her would be very nearly impossible for Julian to escape. The question that remained was how and where to present it. Eleanor chose the Rothmore Harvest Ball, the one occasion each year when the entire county gathered beneath the Ashworth roof, when Julian's reputation stood most fully on display before the people whose regard he valued above nearly everything else. She ensured 2 sitting magistrates and the bishop who had presided over her wedding were among the guests. She asked Penrose to attend, introduced simply as an old family friend. She instructed her lady's maid, Harriet, whose loyalty had been unwavering throughout, to bring the locked case of documents to the small study adjoining the great hall, to be retrieved at the appropriate moment. She dressed, on the evening of the ball, in the same ice-blue silk she had worn the night the gallery mirror first showed her the truth. The great hall glittered with candlelight when she descended, Julian holding court near the fireplace among a cluster of gentlemen that included both magistrates, entirely unaware his wife had spent nearly a year constructing the precise instrument of his downfall. She found Constance near the refreshment table and asked, with mild curiosity, whether she preferred London or the country, watching a flicker of uncertainty cross the other woman's face before it smoothed away again. The moment arrived after the midnight supper when Julian rose to offer his customary toast, praising the blessing of a stable and happy marriage. Eleanor rose as the applause faded. "Before the evening continues," she said, her voice calm and carrying, "I find I have a small matter of household business to address, while so many of our neighbours and several gentlemen of the law are conveniently gathered beneath this roof." Julian's smile faltered. "My dear, surely household matters can wait. I had thought so myself for quite some time," Eleanor said, and the hall fell still. Harriet delivered the case, and Eleanor unlocked it upon a cleared table, drawing out the ledgers, the forged deed, and Whitfield's statement, one by one. "I have compared the disbursement of my own settled funds against the accounts," she said, "and found a pattern of diversion so systematic I can no longer regard it as anything but deliberate." She held up the deed. "I did not sign this document. I have never seen it before this year. Penrose stepped forward to confirm Fenwick's findings and Whitfield's sworn account. Julian, his colour draining, attempted to dismiss the matter as a wife's misunderstanding, the carelessness of overworked clerks. Sir Robert Kingsley, one of the magistrates, stepped forward himself. "Your Grace, I take no pleasure in this, but what has been described constitutes a serious criminal matter that cannot simply be set aside as a private disagreement." It was then, in the charged silence, that Julian demanded to know what had driven her to such a betrayal. Eleanor allowed herself, for the first and only time that evening, to speak of the gallery mirror. "I did not betray our marriage, Julian. I discovered how thoroughly you had already done so yourself. I heard you tell her that I suspected nothing, because there was nothing in me to suspect with. I have spent every day since proving how mistaken you were." A murmur ran through the crowd, heads turning toward Constance, whose composure had entirely deserted her. "I did not step out of the shadows to destroy you," Eleanor said. "I stepped out of them because remaining in them was destroying me." The consequences unfolded swiftly. A formal inquiry began within days, and Whitfield repeated his testimony under oath, sealing the case against any claim that the forgery had occurred without Julian's knowledge. His public standing, cultivated over years of careful charm, collapsed with a speed that seemed to startle even him. The bishop declined, with visible discomfort, to continue extending the friendship he had once offered so freely. Neighbours who had dined at Rothmore Hall for years found sudden reasons to decline future invitations. Constance Whitmore retreated from society within a month. Her townhouse lease quietly surrendered once the flow of stolen income ceased. The legal proceedings were lengthy and occasionally exhausting, requiring Eleanor to recount details of her marriage she would have preferred never to speak aloud. But the outcome, when it arrived some 4 months after the ball, exceeded even what she had privately hoped for. The forged transfer was voided, restoring the disputed land to her settlement. The court ordered a full accounting and restitution from what remained of Julian's fortune. The marriage was dissolved through a formal separation Julian had almost no grounds to contest. Eleanor retained the small dower property settled upon her separately, along with the restored proceeds of her dowry, and a formal acknowledgment entered into the legal record that the fraud committed against her had been deliberate and premeditated. She left Rothmore Hall on a grey morning nearly a year after the night of the mirror, carrying with her very little from the marriage, her mother's pearl combs and the small locked case of documents that had proven in the end more valuable than any dowry her father had ever negotiated. Mrs. Bellingham, the housekeeper who had served 3 generations of Ashworth wives, insisted on overseeing the packing of her carriage herself. "I should have told you sooner what I suspected, Your Grace. I am sorry I did not have the courage." "You were protecting your position," Eleanor told her, "and I understand that better now than I once might have. I fault only the man who made that silence necessary." Harriet came with her, of course, having long since become something closer to a friend than a servant. "I could not imagine remaining in that house without you," she said simply. The house Eleanor came to think of as entirely her own was a modest stone structure in Hampshire, considerably smaller than any residence she had occupied since childhood, possessed of a garden that caught the morning sun and a small library that came with the property. She kept, above the mantel of her new sitting-room, a small mirror, plain and unadorned, nothing like the great tarnished glass in the Rothmore gallery, and she found herself glancing into it sometimes with a curiosity, studying how completely she had become the woman who saw clearly rather than the one who had spent so long looking away. She managed her own accounts without her husband's oversight, corresponded with Penrose regarding the sound investment of her restored fortune, and established a small school for the children of the surrounding parish. Built entirely from her own resources, Her sister Margaret visited often, and on one such evening asked whether Eleanor regretted the long months of patient waiting rather than simply leaving the moment she knew. "I regret the years I spent not seeing what was in front of me," Eleanor answered. "I do not regret the months I spent, making certain no one could ever convince me I had imagined it. I wanted to leave with the truth fully documented, and with enough of my own fortune restored that I would never again depend on any man's goodwill for my survival." The waiting was its own kind of strength. It was the first time in my marriage I was the one deciding when the truth would be revealed, rather than simply reacting to whatever truth was revealed to me. It was through her godmother, Lady Ashcombe, a formidably sharp-tongued widow who had known 3 generations of Ashworth men, that Eleanor came to understand her husband's deception had roots older than his marriage. "Julian's father very nearly ruined this estate through the gaming tables," Lady Ashcombe told her over sherry one afternoon. "His mother spent 2 decades quietly managing and concealing it. I do not think your father knew any of this when he arranged the match. He believed he was securing your future through a respectable arrangement, and I do not think you should hold his ignorance against him." Marsh's later inquiries confirmed it. Julian had spent the better part of a decade servicing his father's hidden gambling debts through Eleanor's own dowry, long before Constance's expenses had ever entered the accounting. Discovery that transformed Eleanor's understanding of her husband from an unfaithful man supporting a mistress into something considerably more calculated, a man who had viewed his young wife's fortune from the very beginning primarily as a solution to problems he had never once told her existed. In the second year of her independence, Eleanor made the acquaintance of Dr. Nathaniel Gray, a widowed physician of scholarly inclination who had taken up practice in the neighboring parish. Their friendship began over a shared interest in the books that had come with her property and grew gradually into something warmer, though Eleanor moved slowly, trusting her own careful observation over any rush of feeling. "I find myself content to continue our acquaintance at whatever pace you judge appropriate," he told her, when she confessed she was in no hurry to decide what her future ought to hold. She admired precisely that he never once presumed his opinion should override her own judgment simply by virtue of his sex or his profession, a quality she had never once experienced during her first marriage. She married him some years later, on her own terms, insisting that her property and her judgment remain entirely her own, regardless of whatever affection they shared. Terms he accepted without hesitation, having no wish, he told her, for a wife who diminished herself in his service. "I will marry you," she told him, "not because I require your protection, all of which I have learned to provide for myself, but because I have found in your company a partnership that asks me to remain fully myself." Harriet, too, found her own happiness, marrying a local schoolmaster she had met through the school's growing connections, and Eleanor stood as witness at her considerably more modest ceremony with genuine pleasure. The school grew over the years into something larger than Eleanor had first envisioned, and she found herself, without ever deliberately seeking the role, becoming a quiet resource for other women who suspected some manner of deception in their own marriages. She answered their letters with the same careful precision she had once brought to Julian's ledgers. "Gather what proof you can, patiently and without haste. Trust what you have observed with your own eyes, even when the world insists you must be mistaken. And remember that dignity does not require silence, whatever you may have been taught to believe." News of Julian reached her only rarely in the years that followed. He remarried eventually, a younger woman of modest fortune, whose circumstances bore an uncomfortable resemblance to Eleanor's own original position, and that marriage, too, ended in separation some years later. Constance lived out her remaining years in quiet obscurity in the north, never marrying, supported by a distant relation's modest annuity. Eleanor felt, hearing each piece of news across the passing decades, considerably less than she once might have expected, understanding that both of them had long since ceased to hold any genuine power over her own happiness. She and Nathaniel had 2 children, a son named William after her own father, and a daughter named Rose, whom Eleanor raised with deliberate attention to ensuring the girl understood, from her earliest years, that her own perceptions carried genuine weight, that she need never learn to doubt the clear evidence of her own eyes simply because the world insisted such doubt was the proper posture of a dutiful young woman. On quiet evenings by the fire, Rose would ask for the story of the mirror, and Eleanor would offer a gentler, simplified version, promising the fuller truth once her daughter was old enough to carry its full weight. She told Rose the complete story on her 16th birthday, recounting the gallery mirror, the months of patient investigation, the confrontation at the ball, and the years of rebuilding that followed. "I am glad you told me, Mama," Rose said afterward. "I think I understand now why you have always told me to trust what I see with my own eyes, even when others insist I must be mistaken." Eleanor understood, in that moment, that she had passed on something considerably more valuable than family history, a genuine inheritance of hard-won wisdom. Lady Ashcombe lived to see both children reach their early years, dying peacefully in her own dower house, leaving Eleanor a letter that concluded, "You were, my dear, the finest proof I ever witnessed that a woman's true character reveals itself not in the ease of her circumstances." Mr. Penrose retired eventually to a cottage near the sea and told Eleanor on her final visit to him that he had never in his long career felt prouder of an outcome than he felt watching her walk out of that ballroom with her evidence fully presented. Bellingham remained at Rothmore Hall until her own retirement, and visited Eleanor's Hampshire garden twice in the years that followed. Sitting there, Eleanor observed, with the contentment of a woman finally permitted to set down burdens of discretion. News of Julian's death reached Eleanor some 22 years after the night of the gallery mirror. In a brief newspaper notice, her husband read aloud over breakfast, not registering its significance until he had finished. Julian had died at Rothmore Hall, the dukedom passing to a distant cousin, no surviving male heir having come of either of his marriages. Eleanor sat with the news a long while, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt neither triumph nor grief in any significant measure, only a settled closure for a chapter she had, in truth, considered concluded for the better part of 2 decades already. In her final years, Eleanor found herself often returning, in quiet reflection, to that single image that had begun everything. 2 reflections layered in a tarnished glass, herself, watching herself watch the truth of her own betrayal unfold. She understood with the wisdom of a long life that the frightened 17-year-old bride and the composed, formidable woman she eventually became had never truly been separate people at all, but 2 stages of the same continuous journey, the girl carrying within her, all along, the capacity to become the woman, however painful, to draw that capacity fully into the light. There was an afternoon, some years before her death, when her granddaughter and namesake, young Eleanor, asked whether she ever regretted the public manner of her revenge, whether a quieter resolution might have spared everyone some difficulty. "I do not think of it as revenge," the elder Eleanor answered. "Revenge seeks chiefly to wound. What I sought was the truth, fully established, and my own rightful independence fully restored. If you ever find yourself standing before your own gallery mirror, whatever form it takes in your own life, remember what I learned that night. The reflection you see there, however painful, is simply the truth waiting patiently to be claimed. You need not rush toward it in fear, nor turn from it in denial. You need only remain patient and clear-eyed and willing, when the moment arrives, to step forward and claim it fully as your own. Eleanor died in her 81st year, in the early spring, surrounded by Rose and William and their own children, having lived to see her story become something of a local legend, told and retold among the families of the county as an example of what a woman might accomplish when she refused to accept the comfortable diminishment all convention had once seemed to demand of her. Rose found, among her mother's papers, a small worn notebook containing private entries kept across the span of her entire remarkable life. Beginning with a single line written the morning after the gallery mirror first revealed Julian's betrayal. I saw myself tonight, standing beside a truth I had spent 3 years refusing to see. I do not yet know what I will do with what I now know, but I know that I cannot unknow it. The final entry, written weeks before her death in a hand grown less steady with age, read, "I am an old woman now, and I find myself thinking, more often than I might have expected, of a young Duchess standing before an old mirror, watching her own reflection watch a truth she was not yet ready to name. I would tell her that the fear she felt was entirely reasonable, and that the woman she would become was already fully present within her, waiting only for the courage to step forward and claim her. The mirror never lied to her, not once, in all the years that followed, and the truest gift it ever gave her was not the painful knowledge of her husband's betrayal, but the far more valuable knowledge of her own reflection, seen clearly and claimed fully for the very first time in her life. Some years after her death, the school she had founded was renamed in her honor, and the governors established, alongside it, a small trust to assist women in circumstances similar to those she herself had once faced, drawing its founding charter directly from the particular combination of patience and courageous public confrontation that had defined her own campaign. Rose, who oversaw the trust's early years, often told visitors the full story of the gallery mirror, understanding it had become, over the years, not merely family history, but a genuine instrument of practical hope for women who might otherwise have believed themselves entirely without recourse. The gallery mirror itself remained, for many years after Julian's death, hanging in its accustomed place at the end of that quiet corridor. Young Eleanor visited it once many years after her grandmother's passing, and stood before the ancient glass exactly as her grandmother once had, understanding that the true legacy of that transformative night had never really been about Julian's exposure or Constance's disgrace. A reflection shows only what already exists, without kindness and without cruelty. The courage lies entirely in choosing, once that reflection has been clearly seen, to step forward out of the shadows and claim it. That, in the end, was the story the gallery mirror told. Across every retelling, across every generation of women who found in Eleanor Ashworth's remarkable life some measure of guidance for their own difficult circumstances. Not merely a story of betrayal discovered, though it contained that painful truth in full measure. Not merely a story of a fortune reclaimed, though that reclamation mattered considerably to the practical shape of her subsequent life. It was, at its deepest core, a story of a woman who looked into an honest mirror, saw her own reflection standing quietly in the shadow of a truth she had not yet claimed, and found within herself, in that single transformative instant, the courage to step forward into the light and become, fully and finally, entirely and unapologetically, herself. There is a final exchange worth recording from a quiet afternoon some years before Eleanor's death, when a young woman named Sophia, distantly connected to the estate by later marriage, sought her out, having heard the remarkable story circulating through the county. "Were you not afraid," Sophia asked, "that you would be discovered before you were ready, and that everything would collapse with nothing gained. "I was afraid nearly every day," Eleanor admitted. "There was a night my husband very nearly discovered the evidence hidden in my own writing desk. A night I still think of with unease even now, safely past its danger. Fear did not leave me at any point. I simply learned to act, despite it, rather than waiting for its absence, which I have come to believe never truly arrives for anyone undertaking something genuinely difficult." "How did you find the courage then?" "I found it in the refusal to let fear make my decisions any longer than it already had. I had spent 3 years of my marriage allowing fear, quiet and unacknowledged, to keep me silent, to keep me accepting circumstances I should never have accepted. Once I finally named it, standing before that gallery mirror, I found I had exhausted whatever patience I once possessed for letting fear govern my choices. I chose from that night forward to let fear accompany me, since I could not banish it entirely, but I refused absolutely to let it lead." Sophia left that afternoon carrying something more than comfort. Eleanor always believed the sense that whatever difficult truth she might one day need to confront in her own life, she now understood how such confrontation might actually be undertaken, patiently, methodically, without waiting for the fear itself to first disappear. It was this quality, Rose would later reflect, compiling the full written history of her mother's life, that made the story endure so persistently across the generations that followed, long after the particular details of Julian's fraud had faded into half-remembered county gossip. It was never really a story about a duke's betrayal, however central that betrayal had once seemed to the frightened young wife who first discovered it. It was always, from the very beginning, a story about a woman learning to trust her own reflection, and finding in that trust the whole of the freedom she had once believed entirely beyond her reach, a freedom no mirror could ever grant outright, but that every honest mirror could help her finally claim as her own. The gallery mirror still hangs, they say, in its accustomed place, tarnished now with the accumulated weight of still further decades, reflecting whatever new occupants happened to pass before it, most of them entirely unaware of the extraordinary history contained within its ancient, honest glass. It asks nothing of those who pass before it, offers no judgment, extends no warning. It simply shows, as it has always shown, exactly what stands before it, layered and true, waiting only for someone patient enough and brave enough to finally look and see and choose exactly as the Duchess of Rothmore once did, alone in a dim gallery on an ordinary evening that became, against every expectation, the true and lasting beginning of her entire remarkable life. It is easy, looking back, to imagine the ending was inevitable, that a woman of Eleanor's evident intelligence was always destined to prevail. But nothing about that outcome was guaranteed. It was built through 1,000 small, deliberate choices, made one at a time, often in fear, often in uncertainty, by a woman who simply refused, again and again, across the long months of her patient campaign. That refusal, more than any single document or any single confrontation, was the true engine of her transformation, and it remains, in the end, the truest inheritance she left behind her, carried forward now by every woman who has ever heard her story and found within it, however faintly, the courage to look into her own mirror and see at last exactly who has been standing there all along, waiting, patient and unafraid, for the moment she was finally ready to step forward and claim her, exactly as she had claimed it once already. On the single, unforgettable night everything began, and every quiet, patient, courageous year that followed after. Right up to the very last morning of her long and remarkable life, when she closed her eyes for the final time, still entirely herself, exactly as she had chosen so many decades before, to become, standing at last in the full and undivided light of her own reflection, seen clearly, claimed fully, and never again surrendered to anyone else's shadow.